Okay, let's get into these meat of these questions. Next question. Whoops. Hi, Phil. Obviously, your opinion is highly valued when you review games of series such as the Hateful Tree. And it's also obvious that you loved role-playing games of the past. Final Fantasy IV, 6, Chrono Trigger is my personal favorite. However, I could be wrong, but it seems that what people are saying is that for some reason you dislike Final Fantasy VII. My question is, what exactly do you dislike about Final Fantasy VII? I personally think that it was a great RPG. Please give us a mini hateful truth about the game. By the way, this is the third time asking the question, but you never responded. So here's hoping to have you answer this. That's from TSF2. So yes, I'm finally going to answer it. I'm not going to do a mini hateful truth because it's going to take too long, but I will say this. The Final Fantasy series of games, when they were going through the Nintendo and the SNES, had this, this evolution. And I really feel that at that time of Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger was the best time for RPGs. There were other series as well that were going on at the same time that were really freaking good. You had Dragon Quest, you had Lunar. There were all these different role-playing games going on at the same time that were really high quality. And then, all of a sudden, Final Fantasy makes this leap to the PlayStation. And it was a giant announcement. It was actually released on 7/7/1997. So it was like even a date. It has a play on numbers. Oh, Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VII. So you start playing it, and let me put it to you this way. I think a lot of people hold Final Fantasy VII on a pedestal because it was the first major RPG to ever be in 3D, meaning to have 3D graphics, not 2D drawn graphics. It was the first CD-based Final Fantasy, okay? And it was on the PlayStation, which was an insanely popular system at the time. Like everyone, you have to get the PlayStation, you have to play Final Fantasy VII, okay? I really think that it was overly hyped. I think that in a lot of people's minds, Final Fantasy VII was actually the first Final Fantasy they ever played, and because of that, they hold it up on this pedestal that this is the best role-playing game ever made. Okay? There are people who will say that Final Fantasy VII is just the best one out of all of them. It just is. And you ask them why, oh, well, the graphics and the story and this gameplay element and that gameplay element. I grew up earlier than that with the earlier Final Fantasies, with Final Fantasy 4 and 6 in particular, which were actually called 2 and 3 in the United States at the time. I thought the story was great. You had a multitude of characters, major story arcs, twists, turns. Final Fantasy 6 in particular, one of the longest, interesting RPG plots that doesn't drag out. That's the other thing about it. It was perfectly paced, never dragged out or felt like it was taking too long, and you get emotional attachment to those characters. Final Fantasy VII, in comparison, the narrative is not that good. There are several parts of the game where the story drags out, several things that are never really explained, big plot holes. For the first time in a Final Fantasy series, the ending was ambiguous and didn't really explain a damn thing about what happened after you beat the game, and actually became kind of anticlimactic because after that, Final Fantasy games and role-playing games in general started having endings that weren't very good. And that was really the first game that kind of did that. Had a, what the fuck did I just see ending? Well, I thought I was going to get more than that. Especially after the ending of Final Fantasy VI, which is like fucking 20 minutes long, explains what happens to every character after the game, an amazingly emotional ending, and then they just throw it all away with Final Fantasy VII. What it really feels like they were trying to do is they were trying to push the series in a different direction, the direction that it's gone in now. Amazing visual presentation. Amazing art direction, okay? Tweaked gameplay to the point where they think it's good, even though the fans might not agree, but kind of going in its own direction and ignoring the fact that the story, the characters, these are the major focuses of role-playing games at that time, that those should be the focus of the game. And I really feel that the game suffered because of that. Again, I think there's a group of people who this was their first role-playing game, and because of that, they hold it on a pedestal, especially because Final Fantasy VIII was fucking horrendous. Final Fantasy VIII, probably by far the worst Final Fantasy game in the series. It was just horribly boring, horrible story, everything about it was horrible, okay? So, having that be the first 3D Final Fantasy, I think it's overhyped, and a lot of people just like it too much, you know what I mean? And, it's funny, again, because, I get the feeling a lot of people who think, oh, it's the best, they never played those classic games. And then if they were to play them today, they probably wouldn't like them because, I don't really like the graphics. They're 2D, Oh, the gameplay is kind of repetitive and boring. Yeah, but that's what JRPGs were back then. You had to walk, fight repetitive enemies, and grind. But that was part of the enjoyment of the game because you leveled up, you gained new abilities and spells by going through the grind. So it was rewarding. It wasn't like a lot of the times today where you just have to go through fights for the sake of going through fights to kill time. And back in those days, there was a purpose to it. So, I don't know. For me, Final Fantasy VII, I'm not saying it's a bad game. I'm just saying I think that it was massively overhyped and that people give it way too much credit because I really think that the story, the narrative, the pacing, the gameplay, and the characters of the previous Final Fantasy games, 4 and 6 in particular, were actually better than Final Fantasy VII, and people just give Final Fantasy VII way too much credit simply because it was 3D. Ooh, the graphics were 3D. You know, there's only so much you can give credit to because they jumped to 3D, okay? Okay. Alright, so then, the new generation of games came out, alright? And the Nintendo 64 came out, but there was this big controversy at the time because here's what happened. Nintendo, in all their wisdom, they've been like this forever, they thought they knew better than everybody else. And they said, listen, we really like the cartridge format. All these other systems that are being developed are all saying they're moving over to CDs. We're not doing that. We're going to put out a new console that's just as good as those, but runs on cartridges. And they did. They called it the Nintendo 64. The problem was, cartridges, number one, were a lot more expensive to develop and produce, and number two, held significantly less data than a CD could. So when Square was actually developing the next Final Fantasy game, they said, we can't fit this fucking game on a Nintendo 64 cartridge. It's too big. And Nintendo said, well, tough titty, we're going ahead with our cartridge-based system. So Square said, all right, then, to hell with you. We're going to develop our next Final Fantasy game. We're actually, for the very first time, taking it off of a Nintendo console, and we're putting it onto the PlayStation 1. And this was huge news at the time. Every gaming magazine's all they talked about. Huge news, Final Fantasy jumping ship from Nintendo to Sony, backing Sony. This is actually going to give Sony like a killer app to buy the PlayStation 1 for. You're definitely going to want a PlayStation 1 to play the next Final Fantasy game. And that's when all the hype started for Final Fantasy VII, and people were like, it's going to be the best Final Fantasy ever because they can't even fit on a cartridge. There's so much content, and it's going to blow you away. It's moving into the 3D realm for the first time. 3D graphics. It's going to be gorgeous. It's going to have awesome sound and whatever. And, you know, I bought into the hype. I did. I said, wow, this is, you know, I can't wait because I remember I played Final Fantasy 2 and 3, or at least what I thought were 2 and 3. And I absolutely loved the games. And I said, wow, they're jumping to 3D. It's going to be so much of a better game. I cannot wait to play this game, okay? So I remember, this is a funny story. I remember the day when Final Fantasy came out, Final Fantasy VII. I think it was actually 7/7/97. So July 7th, 1997, it came out in the United States. And I went to EB Games, Electronics Boutique, to pick up my game. And there was a giant fucking line of people. I was like, there's so many people here to buy this game. This is nuts. And I guess what it was that if you were one of the first, like, 50 people to buy the game, they had promotional posters to give you, and it was a two-sided poster. One side was, like, the box art, and the other side was actually, like, a map of the overworld of the game. So people were, like, loving this. Wow, I came early and I got a map. I remember the guy that was number 50, he got the last poster, and the guy behind line him, he was like, no, you're kidding me, you can't be out, you can't be out. He turns to the guy who's number 50, and he goes, dude, I want your sign, or no, I want your poster, can you give me your poster? And he's like, no, I'm not going to give you my poster, what are you, out of your mind? He goes, all right, I'll pay you, and the guy takes out his wallet. Now keep in mind, this is probably like a guy in his early 20s, so this isn't like a kid who's like begging his mom for the poster, this is like an adult. Oh, I'll pay you. And he pulls out his wallet, and he's like taking wads of cash out of his wallet. I'll pay you for it, man. I'll pay you. I want that poster. And the guy goes, you're out of your mind, buddy. You're not getting my poster. And the guy was like so upset. He was like flipping mad that he couldn't get this poster. Meanwhile, I'm sure the thing's worth nothing today. You know what I mean? But it's just so funny. It was like back then that kind of collectible shit was such a big deal. It wasn't like today where every game that you pre-order, you get a pre-order bonus poster and, you know, some kind of swag or whatever for the game. You didn't really get that often back then. So those people were just like so blown away that you were getting this, and the guy wanted it so bad. He's chasing the guy through the mall with money out of his pocket like a knucklehead. All right. So here's my honest opinion on Final Fantasy VII, alright? And I know this is going to be controversial. A lot of people have asked me about Final Fantasy VII in the past, and what I thought about it, and what Square did with it. If you want my honest opinion, I think that Final Fantasy VII was a critical development point for the series. It was where they decided, whoever it was who was in charge, said we don't want to keep making the same style of game. We want to start mixing it up. We want to start changing things so that this could be like we could say it's different, all right? And so they changed some critical things, although for the most part, the gameplay of Final Fantasy VII is extremely similar to the same turn-based combat of the previous Final Fantasy games. But they made critical design decisions with the game that kind of threw me for a loop, all right? Number one, the music. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some iconic tunes in Final Fantasy VII, like the boss theme, or the theme of, what was it, Red 13's Town or whatever, where it goes dun 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 bum 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 bum. Like, those themes were really iconic, but again, guess why? Because Nuobu was the guy who did the music for the game. But for me, and this could just be me, but I was like an audiophile. Like I said, I really liked the audio of the Final Fantasy series. It didn't sound as good as the music that was on the SNES cartridges. It just didn't to me for whatever reason. I actually thought that the music that came out of the SNES cartridge sounded more like an orchestra than the tunes that came out of Final Fantasy VII on a PlayStation 1 off of a disc. And in fact, in some parts, I almost felt that like the music sounded like MIDI music from off of a computer. Now, you might not know what a MIDI is, especially since they've been outdated for a long time, but it was a music format back in the 90s people used to make songs with, but it's a very low-quality format. You can't do high-quality audio on a MIDI. But that's kind of what it sounded like. It almost sounded to me like they had good music, and they compressed it to make it fit on the disc, and somehow it lost its quality. And I don't know, maybe it's just me being an audiophile, but I always took issue with the way that the Final Fantasy VII sounded. Okay? Now, another thing that really, really pissed me off about the game, the ending. It's horrible. Every Final Fantasy game up to then had an ending that fleshed out what happened, especially the two that I had played, Final Fantasy 2 and 3, which is what they were calling the US, had extended endings where you would follow along the characters, find out what happened to the characters after the game ended. It even had kind of epilogues. Final Fantasy 3's ending is like 25 minutes long. It's insane. That's like the best way to end a game. Final Fantasy 7, there's a final boss and then a final boss after that's kind of weird because it's nothing like anything else in the game, and then one pre-rendered cutscene that lasts like 30 seconds and the game fucking ends. I remember beating Final Fantasy 7. Okay? And I stood there at the ending screen when the credits started rolling, and I went, is that it? I just played this game for how many hours, and that was the fucking ending? I invested all this time and effort into the game. This is a series that always has had rewarding endings. What the fuck happened? It's almost like they didn't want to end the game. They didn't have a definitive ending, so they just said, here, look at this generic cutscene that doesn't explain anything, and the game's over. And I was like, what the fuck? Like, seriously, like, what the fuck were they thinking with that? I just, to this day, I still can't understand what they were thinking, okay? And also, I didn't like the fact that in Final Fantasy VII, you could only have a 3-character party. This was the very first Final Fantasy game where they reduced the party size. Ever since before then, it had at least been 4 characters at a time. This was the first game where it was less than that. It was only 3. And I said, I don't understand. If you have better technology, more storage capacity, better graphics, why would you reduce the amount of characters that you're playing with? And that's what I really found odd about the game. I liked having a big party with a variety of characters who were all unique and different. Instead, now it was more like, well, here's three and too bad. Deal with it. And it was funny because since then, think about Final Fantasy since then. A lot of them, including 8, I don't know about 9 because I didn't really play it that much, but 10, 10-2, they all have 3 characters. Even today, Final Fantasy 13, 3 characters. Like, why did they reduce it to 3 characters and then stick with that formula? I don't understand that. Very confusing to me, okay? So, I thought that Final Fantasy VII was a disappointment. Not to say that I didn't enjoy the game, I absolutely did. There are a couple parts that I really fucking hate, like the stupid Shinra Tower. It's the most stupid, you don't know where the fuck to go, you don't know what you're supposed to be doing, you have limited resources, it just keeps droning on and on and on. And there's some parts in the game that are like that, and I'm like, they could have definitely streamlined this game and made it a little better. I actually liked the pacing and the combat and the gameplay and the story of Final Fantasy 2 and 3 a hell of a lot more than Final Fantasy 7. But the thing that really pissed me off is that the game got insanely overhyped just because it was on PlayStation 1 and on a fucking disc. It was like, it's the first 3D Final Fantasy, it's on a disc, it's the best Final Fantasy ever. Like, no, it's not. I actually like Final Fantasy 2 and 3 better than I like 7, but people were just, like, insanely hyped for this game. Now, for a lot of people, Final Fantasy VII is the very first Final Fantasy game they ever played, because that was the era when they got into console gaming, and for them, they almost look out, put it on a pedestal and say that's like one of the best games of all time, to which I beg to differ. I'm like, sorry, if you haven't really played all the other Final Fantasies, you can't make that statement, alright? So here we go. After 5 years of waiting, ladies and gentlemen, I'm about to reveal the game that I was going to play in Project 7. Ladies and gentlemen, the game that we are talking about is a game that many of you guessed over the years, some of you did not. The game is, yes, you've probably figured it out by now, Final Fantasy VII. Okay, well, it was Project 7, Final Fantasy 7, that was so easy to figure out. But, you know, over the years, I kind of tried to do things to, you know, get people to not think that that's what it was. And quite honestly, over the years, I had ideas that it would be something different. I kind of thought in my head, maybe I'll change it. But Final Fantasy VII. Don't take this the wrong way. You know what? I already can tell you, this video is going to have tons of thumbs down. Everyone, oh, Phil's talking bad about Final Fantasy 7 and Project 7 and all that. Thumbs down. I don't care. You know what? I'll thumbs down the goddamn video. I don't care, all right? Final Fantasy 7, in my opinion, is one of the most over-regarded, overpraised, kiss-assed games of all time and doesn't deserve it. Here's why. Number one, the game released on PlayStation 1. It was a huge acquisition for PlayStation because up to that point, the Final Fantasy series had only been on Nintendo. So to go from Nintendo and kind of jump ship to Sony was a huge deal. Number two, it was one of the first major RPGs to have 3D graphics. Yes, most RPGs at the time were still 2D animated sprites. This was the first game to jump into full 3D. Okay? And so people, oh, it's so hyped because it's 3D. Number three, because the series already had such a huge installed fan base, regardless of the fact that the game might not have been, in my opinion, as good as previous games in the Final Fantasy series, people felt this was the future. This is the jump from Final Fantasy to the modern era. This is the game. This is what people say. Final Fantasy VII is the game that brought Western JRPGs to America and made them popular. I completely fucking disagree. I think that JRPGs were already popular in America. Here's what I think. Final Fantasy VII was the first game to receive insane media hype because at that point, magazines and everything was becoming huge business. So let's hype the fuck out of Final Fantasy VII. We'll sell a ridiculous amount of magazines. We'll sell, you know, ridiculous, because it's not like it is today where it's all about the internet and everything was free. Back then you had to go buy the magazine to get the news on the new game. And I remember 7797. Everything was 77777. Buy Final Fantasy VII. And people who didn't even play video games ran out and bought PlayStations and bought Final Fantasy VII because it got so fucking overhyped. So, that was the game that I was going to play, and I was going to do gameplay of it, like do a playthrough I would say off stream, gee, I didn't stream back then, but I was going to do a playthrough on camera with my old camera like I used to, but it wasn't going to upload the footage raw. I was going to use that footage in the series, okay? Final Fantasy VII has a lot that can be made fun of, alright? Just off the top of my head, a few silly things about the game that I know could be hilarious in a series. Number one, why do the characters in the game, in combat, look normal? In combat in Final Fantasy VII, they walk up, they've got normal proportioned bodies, they look really cool, they kind of look like anime characters. Then they go to anything outside of combat, and they're like little squished chibi characters with really disproportioned heads and limbs, and it makes no fucking sense. Why did they do that? If you could obviously make the characters normal size in the combat, why couldn't you do that in the normal game? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any logical sense. I think it's honestly because it was going to take too much storage space.
because the game itself, I believe, was 3 or 4 discs at launch, and at that time, that was one of the, 4 discs at launch. It was high production cost, and so they said, oh, we want to, no way we could have another disc or 2 to have the characters look higher resolution or better outside of combat, but it was so silly. I think the characters look terrible in the game. The music, I hate to say this because I know a lot of people love the soundtrack of Final Fantasy VII. I actually do. I love the overworld theme, and I love the boss battles theme of Final Fantasy VII. I also love the song at the end, the Sephiroth song, One Winged Angel. I love that song. Oh, and the Genova theme I like. So there's like 4 songs in the game I really like. But compared to the soundtracks of Final Fantasy IV and VI, the other 2 games that had been localized for American audiences as Final Fantasy II and III, I like the soundtracks of those games way better than I like the soundtrack of Final Fantasy VII. In fact, if you listen to the music of Final Fantasy IV or VI, and then you listen to the soundtrack of Final Fantasy VII, you're like, this game was on a CD. Why the hell does the audio, the game music sound so terrible? Because it does. It sounds like MIDI music. It's like bum, 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 bum. Wait a minute. It's on a CD. You couldn't hire a fucking real musician to fucking play the music. And the funny thing is, it was, Nobuo Uematsu who orchestrated all this music, but the music sounds like shit a lot in the game. But then he went and he did symphonies, and he has a band who plays it, and the music sounds fucking badass. Why couldn't they make it? It's a CD fucking game. Record real quality music and put it on the CD. Don't fucking, and that was the thing, because again, space constraints, right? But for me, it's like, you're bringing this game into the new era, the era of CDs. Go all out. And it seems like they kind of skimped. The music wasn't as high quality as I would have liked it to be. I didn't like that the graphics were different in combat than outside of combat. It looked like little chibis. And also, the characters. Some of the characters in Final Fantasy VII are the poorest developed characters I've seen in a role-playing game. Coming off of games like Final Fantasy IV and VI, where every character had this big fleshed-out story, with a few exceptions here or there. But when you played a character in those games, you cared about that character. You learned about their backstory. You learned about their personality traits. Some of the characters in Final Fantasy VII is like Kate Sith. It's a fucking robot that's controlled by someone who works for the Shinra Corporation. And that's it. Like, there's almost no backstory for Kate Sith. You can play as the character for most of the game, but there's never really that much backstory. It's never really, it's not fleshed out. There's entire characters in that game. Cloud. Cloud sucks. Cloud sucks as a protagonist because he's got amnesia. So he's really a non-character. He's a brood, emo, brood. And he was kind of the first kind of stereotypical JRPG character that's the stereotypical male character brooding, and it's stupid. In my opinion, I thought that the characters, the protagonists from the previous Final Fantasy games were way better. I could sit here and talk about Final Fantasy VII for about 4 hours and tell you why I don't think the game is anywhere near as good as Final Fantasy IV or VI, just from my perspective. But I'm sure there's tons of people out there who are going to disagree with me because they've got those rose-colored glasses on, right? This was the first major Final Fantasy game that hit Western shores and was super hyped by American media. And people loved it. It sold like crazy. And some people, this was their first Final Fantasy. So for them, of course, you're going to say, well, this is the best Final Fantasy. And I completely disagree. Now, I will obviously agree that there were other Final Fantasies that were far worse than 7. I thought that 8 was fucking atrociously bad. And I think 10 is actually pretty good. Now that I've played the whole game, I think it's a pretty good game. I actually never played. I had 12, but I never played significantly into it. I got so caught up with the open world combat at 12 that I played it more for the combat than the story. But I digress. Final Fantasy VII was the game I was going to play. And you might not know this, so here's some more reveals, right? In 2010, I actually played it. I played like half of the game. I got all the way... I actually remember, I got to the Shinra Corporation. I fucking hate that stage. That's one of the most poorly designed stages in a JRPG I've ever played because you don't know where you're supposed to be fucking going. You end up walking in circles. You end up getting so many random encounters that the fucking thing takes hours to beat. And unless you know exactly where to go with what key card to open what fucking door on what elevator, you could be stuck in Shinra Corporation for like hours on end, and it's torture. Once you get past Shinra Corporation, the game actually picks up, and there's a couple really good parts of Final Fantasy VII. But I remember I was doing this playthrough, and I had already done 2 to 3 sessions of gameplay at the time. We're talking hours, because back then I used to record for a long time. So we're talking, I probably had like 10, 15 hours of gameplay of Final Fantasy VII recorded. And it just never came together. I had the gameplay, and it never came together that I made the series back then. And I even had the infamous bathhouse scene, the infamous cross-dressing scene, all the infamous, ridiculous, silly, Japanese culture hilarity that really doesn't translate well into American culture. All those jokes, I'm all filmed and ready to go. I never did anything with it.